Now, before we go any further, let me clarify that the Yakuza has its roots in two distinct pre-industrial age groups: the Tekiya, who started off as wandering merchants, and the Bakuto, gamblers whose roots stretch back nearly 1,000 years. Since most of the Yakuza's history and traditions are tied to the gamblers, the name Yakuza itself comes from a losing hand in a card game, we're going to focus on them in this episode. And in order to understand them, we're going to do a deep dive into the history of gambling in Japan. And I promise you, it's quite interesting. So when you think of gambling, you might think of something that was a prerogative of the boorish lower classes, but actually the earliest references to gambling in Japan go all the way back to the 7th century AD, during the late Asuka period, when betting was all the rage in the imperial court. In fact, according to the author of one of Japan's earliest written records, the Nihonchoki, the Emperor Temmu himself loved to gamble. In one chapter, the emperor, quote, took his place in the great hall of audience, summoned the princes and ministers before the hall, and made them gamble. Scholars assume the gambling took place over a game of suguroku, or double sixes, a type of backgammon introduced from China sometime in the 6th century. It was such a popular game to bet on, the word suguroku might even have been used as a synonym for the word gambling. Go was another popular board game people loved to bet on, especially during the Heian period, which lasted from the 8th century until the 12th century AD. And we know this because we have epigraphical evidence. According to the diary of Lady Murasaki, most famously known as the author of the Tale of Genji, quote, the governor of Harima threw a banquet as forfeit for losing a game of Go. By the way, long before Japanese crime syndicates used gambling terminology to describe things, a group of nobles, including Sei Shonagon, a contemporary of Lady Murasaki, and author of the Pello book, used Go terminology as code to gossip about other people's relationships. Huh. But board games were not the only things nobles bet on. They loved gambling so much they bet on everything. Cockfights, horse races, dice, archery, cricket fights, poetry contests, and fancy competitions that made use of flowers, pictures, or even folding fans. Sei Shonagon even made a wager with an empress about whether or not a giant pile of snow would melt before a certain date. She lost the bet, but only because the empress kind of cheated. Then in the 12th century, things began to change. After the warrior class, or buke, began to accumulate wealth and power, they too began to place their bets. Sometime between the late 13th century and the 16th century, samurai introduced a new type of gambling that involved, get this, tea. The reason is because during this period, tea was extremely rare and expensive, and drinking it was considered a luxury. Among the warrior class, tocha, tea fighting, or chayoriai, tea meetings, became a popular pastime. During these tea gatherings, in which people dressed in flamboyant costumes called basara style, samurai would partake in a big meal, drink lots of different kinds of tea, and then bet their valuables by guessing the tea's origins. These valuables, or quote-unquote prizes, included sake, noodles, a fan, shoes, straw matting, and even a chicken coop. Yes, people continued to bet anything on everything. And the betting only got more frantic when the Portuguese showed up on Japanese shores in the 16th century and introduced playing cards.